subscribe and tap the bell. Twice a day, we bring you the real code of the samurai, not paraphrased, not softened. In 1645, an old man walked into a cave on a mountainside in Kumamoto and stayed there, largely alone, for the final weeks of his life. His name was Miyamoto Musashi, and by then he'd already fought and won more than 60 duels, founded his own school of swordsmanship, and lived long enough to watch the entire era of open dueling he'd made his name in start to fade into a more settled, bureaucratic peace. He wasn't in that cave to fight anymore. He was there to write down everything he'd learned, before none of it could be asked of him directly again. What came out of that cave is known today as Go-Rin no Sho, the Book of Five Rings, and it remains one of the only surviving texts written by a genuinely undefeated master, describing not just how he won, but how he thought. The book is organized around 5 sections, each named for one of the classical elements: earth, water, fire, wind, and void. That structure alone tells you something about how Musashi approached mastery. He didn't write a simple manual of sword techniques. He built something closer to a complete framework for how a serious student should approach any discipline, starting with the ground you stand on and ending with a concept most translators struggle to render precisely at all, a state beyond fixed technique, where the practitioner has absorbed the rules so completely that they stop needing to consciously apply them. The Earth book lays the foundation, Musashi's overall approach to strategy and how he believed a student should structure their training from the very beginning, treating the path to mastery as something built in a specific order, not something you can shortcut by jumping straight to advanced technique. The Water book, named for water's ability to take the shape of whatever container holds it, deals with the specific mechanics of swordsmanship, but the underlying idea reaches further than any one weapon. An adaptable practitioner, one who can meet whatever situation actually arrives rather than the situation they train for in the abstract, will consistently beat a rigid one. The Fire book is where the text turns most directly toward combat itself, reading an opponent, understanding rhythm and timing, recognizing the difference between your opponent's real intentions and the feints designed to disguise them. This is also where Musashi's ideas translate most cleanly outside of swordsmanship, because timing and rhythm aren't unique to combat. Anyone who's negotiated a deal, competed in a sport, or simply tried to read a room full of people knows that success often comes down to sensing when to act and when to hold, a skill that has almost nothing to do with technical proficiency and everything to do with attention. The Wind book takes a different approach entirely. Rather than describing his own method further, Musashi uses it to examine other schools of swordsmanship, their assumptions, and where he believed they fell short. It's a chapter built on comparison, on understanding what you're not doing and why, which is itself a discipline most people skip. It's far easier to describe your own approach than to seriously study your rival's approaches well enough to explain their weaknesses accurately, but Musashi treated that comparative study as essential, not optional, to fully understanding his own path. And then there's the Void, the shortest section, and the one that resists simple summary the most. Musashi uses it to describe a state beyond calculated technique entirely, a mind so thoroughly trained that it no longer needs to consciously apply any rule, because the rules have become instinct. This isn't mysticism for its own sake. It's a description of what real mastery in any field eventually looks like, the point where a skilled craftsman, musician, or fighter stops thinking through the steps and simply acts correctly, without the deliberate calculation a beginner requires. Getting there, in Musashi's account, requires that everything in the Earth, Water, Fire, and Wind books be fully absorbed first. The Void isn't a shortcut past the work. It's what waits on the other side of it. It's worth being honest about the limits of any single English rendering of this text. Musashi wrote in 17th century Japanese, dense with martial vocabulary specific to a style of swordsmanship that no longer gets practiced with live blades, and translators have argued for decades over exactly how to render his most compressed ideas. The Void especially has been translated a dozen different ways by a dozen different scholars, none of them claiming to have settled the question completely. That's not a flaw in the book. It's a sign of how much is actually packed into a text short enough to read in an afternoon, and dense enough that people are still arguing over its precise meaning nearly 4 centuries later. What makes the Five Rings worth studying today isn't nostalgia for a dead style of combat. It's that Musashi wrote from a position almost nobody else writing about mastery can claim. He tested every idea in the book against opponents trying to kill him, in a career where a single miscalculation meant his own death, not a lost match or a bruised ego. When he writes about timing, rhythm, or adaptability, he's not offering an abstract theory. He's reporting what actually worked across 5 decades and more than 60 duels, distilled at the very end of his life into the clearest form he could manage before running out of time to say it. That's also the real reason this book keeps getting picked up by people who will never hold a sword: strategists, business people, martial artists in disciplines that didn't exist in Musashi's era. The specific weapon changes. The underlying demand doesn't. Build your foundation properly. Stay adaptable to what's actually in front of you rather than what you rehearsed. Study your rivals as seriously as you study yourself, and keep training past the point where technique still requires conscious thought. That's the same path Musashi walked from a duel at 13 to a cave at the end of his life, and the book he left behind is the clearest map of it that survives. Applied practically, the order matters as much as the content. Most people trying to master a skill today skip straight to advanced technique, hunting for the one trick that shortcuts the years of foundation Musashi insists on building first. His structure argues the opposite: get the earth right before you worry about the fire. Build the basic, unglamorous foundation so thoroughly that it stops requiring attention, and only then turn your focus toward reading the specific, shifting conditions in front of you, an opponent, a market, an audience, the way the water and fire books demand. Skip that order, and you end up with exactly what Musashi spent his whole career beating: a fighter with impressive individual technique and no real foundation underneath it, undone by the first opponent who refuses to fight the way he expected. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Twice a day, we bring you Bushido straight from the source, the real words of the man who wrote the code down, and the real warriors who lived it.